So today I want to describe my research program. It's one that centers on a single two-part question, and that's what does a public right to hear mean in an online environment, and why does this right matter? So what I'm going to do is unpack exactly what I mean by a public right to hear, offer a couple of examples about where I think this right is happening and being worked out today, and conclude with some thoughts on why this work matters. So what I mean by a public right to hear is coming across ideas in a meaningful way that you probably wouldn't hear, that you wouldn't have heard, you might not have chosen to hear in a purely market-oriented system. So to be clear, I don't mean that you can't say things that you want to say, or that you must listen to things that you don't want to, or that you have to believe things that you don't agree with. What I'm talking about is not censorship or coercion or propaganda in any way. What I mean is it simply means that you have the chance to benefit from encountering ideas, good ideas that aren't exactly what you would think, or that a market might not show you. So backing up a little bit, my claim rests on a slightly different notion of individual freedom than I think we're used to or familiar with in Western societies. And it's this: someone's personal freedom has two equal parts to it. The first part is this need to be left alone, to pursue principles and ideas and priorities without illegitimate interference from other people. This is how we usually think about freedom, as this right to be left alone. And the second is this need to encounter a diverse set of resources that you normally wouldn't have been able to create on your own, and the capacity and the opportunity to use them. You might call them public goods. So freedom, in a sense, means two things, and I want to hold that constant during this talk. It means freedom from, and it means freedom to. We need both, and both matter. So in terms of internet freedom from is fairly well understood at this point. It's behind a lot of the libertarian thinking that says that we should leave people alone to say what they want to say online, to create for themselves the kinds of systems and technologies and filters that they want. The assumption is that quality speech will bubble up, and the emphasis is usually on getting people to speak more, getting them to say more. And the idea is that given all this speech, people can create customized and personalized environments that let them do the kind of hearing they want to do as individuals. And this is not a bad thing at all, and it's an essential part of online freedom in an internet context. But what we understand much less right now is what this freedom to looks like online, what this affirmative or positive notion of freedom looks like, what it means to make sure that we have the chance to encounter and learn from new voices and new ideas, and to be able to change our minds for different reasons. So my research program asks where this right to hear exists online, and it focuses on two areas. One is the press, which is a fairly mature project right now, and the other is algorithms, which is a newer area that I'm thinking through and developing. So what kinds of systems help us hear? So I see the press as a quote-unquote listening institution because in its ideal form, and this is a problematic form for sure, it should help us hear timely and high-quality perspectives that we normally wouldn't encounter or seek out if we were completely left alone. So the reason it's so hard and contentious to talk about the press is because it often fails to be all things to all people. It fails to be editor, researcher, curator, filter, watchdog, alarm bell, commentator, representative, storyteller, entertainer. It rarely does all of these things well. And it's a larger point that I'll just assert here since I don't have time to unpack it, but I kind of agree with John Dewey, who said that news is this any information whose truth matters to you. That is, whether something is true, it has practical consequence, whether short or long-term impact to you on your life. The press should help us understand things, but things that matter to us. So studies of what kinds of content emerge from marketplace orientations of press with high concentrations of media ownership in which a few people control many different channels have shown us that choice is not the same thing as diversity. A free market is not the same thing as a free press. Left purely to market forces, it's nearly impossible for the press to guarantee our public right to hear. Today, this ideal looks different. The materials and the economics of news production online have changed radically and irreversibly, and will probably continue to do so. People online can sustain their own networks, create their own ideas of news and consequences, craft their own relationships, signal their own truths, but this right, or this need to hear, has not gone away. It exists instead in the way that the press negotiates with publics, as much as it listens to them, as much as it talks to them. So this renegotiation is happening in a few different places between press and publics. And one of the places in which I see it is in application programming interfaces, or what are called APIs. And I don't have time to go into this in detail, but an API is essentially, it's a window on data, and it's also a toolbox for data. So we can think of the post office as a kind of API in a sense. You understand how to behave in relation to it, but you don't need to understand exactly how it works. Follow its rules, pay your money. You can be reasonably sure that you can send and receive mail. And today I want to argue that the press is starting to look a little like a post office. It's opening up its databases, its collections of images and text and video and metadata to the public in new ways through APIs. So if you're interested and you have the programming skills and you're willing and able to follow the rules that the press creates for you, you can create a website or a news feed, whatever it is that you like. These are kind of like RSS feeds on steroids in a way. So essentially, this responsibility for the public right to hear exists now not in just the press alone, but in this intersection between presses and publics. And this is an intersection that's regulated by APIs in part. So in my ongoing study of 3 news organizations, the Guardian, National Public Radio, and the New York Times, I found this intersection between the public and the press being controlled in 3 main ways. First, there's the architecture. What is it that a news organization's data and system allow you to do as the programmer, what it lets you see and control and create? The second level of control is this contract, or this sort of regulatory idea. What kinds of access do you gain as long as you agree to follow particular rules in exchange for the press giving you access to their data? And the third is this community level, which has pretty complex social relationships in it, but it essentially says what kinds of signals and expectations and approval and guidance do you get from other coders, your users of your system, the news organization, who sometimes might let you break rules in ways that it's not necessarily going to publish. So what I want to argue essentially is today is if we understand the press as this guarantor of this public right to hear, one place to understand it is in some of these new social and technical and regulatory aspects, like an API, where we start to see an online professional press negotiating with networked programming publics. So one of the other ways that I'm thinking about this and in trying to understand this public right to hear is looking at algorithms that sort and that rank and relate speech to each other. So my aim here is to understand how the social and the technical features of these kinds of systems influence how we encounter new ideas and how we might change our minds. So one example is the online marketplace and recommendation systems that a lot of us have encountered online. On the one hand, these are commercial tools. They're simply about helping us navigate this sort of large space of shopping options, helping us relate one product to another. But on the other hand, they're sort of systems that suggest ideas and values about how customers might be like one another. So if you like X, if you are like X, you might also be like Y, not just if you like X, you might like Y. So these systems offer signals to us as citizens/consumers, where that line is blurring, about how we should or how the systems expect us to relate to each other. And these signals are not as obvious or explicit as some of the ones we encounter in political campaigns. They're not being given to people every day during the course of an election or a political crisis in an obvious way. They tend to be emergent, and they're emergent in some complex ways. They're not crafted by any single person or any single system. Instead, they grow out of how designers create systems and how the customers interact with them. So more subtly, I think, than the press and the APIs, this public right to hear in this context depends on this negotiation between designers of systems that recommend and relate data and the publics whose clicks and navigations in some way shape how the systems behave. An example here might illustrate this. So for a while, the Android marketplace listed an application called Sex Offender Search as the most related app to Grindr. So Sex Offender Search is an app that it shows the homes of registered sex offenders on a map, and using your GPS, it can show you where you are in relation to these homes. Grindr is an app targeted toward gay men that shows where you are in relation to other men who might be looking for men, whether that means chatting, friendship, sex, or some combination thereof. But most broadly, these apps are about locating men in space. I think that's about where you could stop with that explanation. But the fact that such a controversial association is offered without commentary or explanation or transparency by the system can, for some people, be a little intuitively unsettling. At the very least, a conversation here needs to be had about where this association came from and what kind of cultural work it might be doing. So to be clear here, I do not think that anyone involved in this example, whether it's Google or Grindr or sex offender search, intended the association. It's not a story about what's intended or not, nor do I think that everyone who saw the connection accepted it uncritically. It's also not about assuming that people are just robots who are going to accept uncritically stories and associations are told to them. The example merely shows, I think, that these systems make associations that are not neutral, and that such associations are deeply tied to different values and cultural assumptions. So what are the different kinds of assumptions or associations going on here? One are technical relationships between pieces of data. So this is how the rules of relational databases work to decide that one app is like another app or one product is like another product. The second is this sort of participatory moves or relationships that are read into people's actions online, read into their marketplace decisions and movements. So this is how the system makes sense of a pattern of clicks and downloads and decides that people may be related to each other. And the third are some social and cultural logics that emerge that sort of exist alongside but also intersect with the marketplace. And these are beliefs that people have about whether these associations are valid or not, or what the legitimacy is that they're based upon. So essentially, this public right to hear, to encounter new ideas that you wouldn't normally find on your own, exists within the kind of associational thinking or the kind of pattern matching represented by this collection of systems, users, and cultures that exist. So all of these ideas and all these work need more work. My aim here is to just illustrate this argument through two examples. These two examples, the network press and the online marketplace, are meant to highlight a single point. And that's that our right to hear depends on socio-technical systems that we need to be able to look inside and to better understand. We might better think of these as listening institutions, as learning environments, in which we not only just learn what the press tells us, but we learn how the press tells us. We don't just accept the associations that marketplaces make, but we start to critically think about why those associations exist. So today I want to argue that this right to hear is actually distributed in networks across people and machines. And given this need to work with and understand large amounts of data, I don't think these issues are going to disappear. This is a continuing effort to try to make sense of the vast majority of data that exists on the internet. But what remains, I think, is this notion of a two-part freedom, this freedom from and this freedom to. And this means understanding how and why big data systems are built and what kind of public life they're building for us. So the research program today that I'm unpacking, it aims to tackle just one aspect of this emerging field, and that's how we can understand a public right to hear in terms of social networks, technological systems, and cultural logics that both shape and reveal our life on public. Thanks.